They told him to pull the fire back. He told them to drop it closer. Snow and dirt were still pattering down on his helmet from the last salvo, when the voice crackled over the phone line from 3 miles behind the front. "Lieutenant, you're in that target zone. Say again. Confirm fire for effect on these coordinates." First Lieutenant Garland Merl, GM Connor, wiped blood and melted snow out of his eyes with the back of his glove, and risked another look over the rim of the ditch he was lying in. The German infantry were less than 100 yards away now, shadows slithering from tree to tree in the white woods, rifles at the hip, moving in that horrible practiced rhythm of men who knew exactly how to close and kill a pinned-down defender. Behind them, 6 Tiger tanks, 60-ton monsters, pushed through the trees like they were saplings, fanning out into a wedge. One had already blown an American Foxhole to pieces with a lazy snap of its 88mm gun. Another was traversing to take its turn. Connor was 30 yards in front of his own battalion's Foxholes, in a frozen drainage ditch maybe 18 inches deep. Snow on his helmet, wounds from his last trip to the hospital barely knit. A field telephone and 400 yards of wire his only connection to a dozen 105mm howitzers somewhere in the rear. If those guns fired wide, 3rd Battalion died. If they walked their fire back far enough to be safe, 6 Tigers and 600 German infantry would roll right over the line. If he gave them what they needed, a correction tight enough to matter, it would also put him squarely under 48 high-explosive shells every 60 seconds. The rational thing was to pull the impacts away from his position. Connor wasn't in a rational mood. He pressed the handset to his ear, shouted over the artillery roar. "Repeat. Drop 50. Fire for effect. Right on me." For a second, the fire died. Rection officer hesitated. You could hear it in the thin slice of silence on the line. "Lieutenant, those shells will be in your lap." Connor looked at the Tigers, now barely 250 yards away, turrets searching for more foxholes to erase. "In my lap is where they need to be." He ducked as another battery's worth of shells tore the sky apart around him. If this was how it ended, he thought, at least it would take a lot of them with him. That was 07:30 in the morning on January 24, 1945. On the frozen flank of a pocket of German-held territory in eastern France, called the Colmar Pocket. To understand how a 5'6", 120-pound tobacco farmer from Kentucky ended up lying in front of his own battalion, calling down artillery on himself to stop 6 Tiger tanks, you have to go back a few years. Back to hot dust, not deep snow. Back to a kid who'd dropped out of school because the nearest high school was 15 miles away, and there was work to be done in the fields. Back to a morning in March 1941, when his world went from tobacco rows to formation rows. Garland Merl Connor grew up in Clinton County, Kentucky. On a farm that didn't have a lot of room for childhood. The Connors raised tobacco. That meant early mornings, late nights, and days that blurred into each other under the weight of labor. Books existed, but the nearest real school was 15 miles away. You don't do 15 miles there and back, and still have time to plow and plant and cure unless you're a superhero. GM wasn't a superhero. He was just tough. Smart in the way a man gets smart when he has to read the land, the weather, and other people without the benefit of much paper. By the time he was 21, in March 1941, the news out of Europe had been bad for a long time. France overrun, Britain hanging on, Hitler's boots in half the countries on the map. The United States wasn't in the war yet, but even in rural Kentucky, a man could feel it coming. Connor went into town and enlisted in the army. He didn't have a high school diploma. He had something else. A willingness to go where he was told and do what needed doing. The army sent him to the infantry. They sent him to the 7th Infantry Regiment, part of the 3rd Infantry Division. the Rock of the Marne outfit that had stopped the Germans in 1918 and was about to spend the next 4 years doing some of the dirtiest work in the European theater. He landed in North Africa, then Sicily, then Italy. He went ashore in not 1, not 2, but 4 amphibious assaults. Over the course of the war, Sicily, Salerno, Anzio, and southern France. He was wounded so many times that men lost count. 7 major wounds in 4 years. Shrapnel, bullets, concussions. Each time he found his way back. Sometimes against orders that said, stay in the hospital. Sometimes against common sense. Connor was not supposed to be the kind of officer who did what he did at Colmar. On paper, he was the battalion's chief intelligence officer. His job description: sit in the battalion command post, collect and analyze reports from patrols, interrogate prisoners, mark German positions on maps, brief the CO. Intelligence officers were supposed to be behind the lines. They weren't supposed to lead attacks, crawl into minefields, or sprint under fire. Connor read that job description like a suggestion, not a rule. By late 1943, he had already earned 4 Silver Stars for valor. In October 1943 in Italy, he'd led an assault that took a key hill. In January 1944, at Anzio, he'd repeatedly crawled forward under fire to bring in wounded. In September 1944 in France, he'd taken charge when other leaders fell and driven his men through an enemy position. In February 1945, after the Colmar action we're talking about, he would do it again. Whenever the situation turned truly bad, men in a 3rd Battalion had a grim joke. Where's Connor? Because if things were going completely sideways, odds were good their quiet, wiry intelligence officer was already moving toward the front. He collected wounds the way some officers collected commendations. He collected commendations too. He just never changed the way he operated. By January 1945, the war in Western Europe was in a strange place. The Allies had landed in Normandy, broken out, swept across France. The German army was back on its own borders, bleeding hard. Then came the counterpunches. The Battle of the Bulge, in the Ardennes up north, Hitler's last bid to split British and American forces, and further south, in Alsace and Lorraine. Operation Nordwind. Hitler's last major offensive against the U.S. 7th Army and the French First Army. Along the Upper Rhine, the Germans had dug in around the city of Colmar, refusing to yield a pocket of land west of the river about 850 square miles wide. Forest, fields, tiny villages, snow, the Colmar Pocket. They'd held it since November 1944. Every attempt to pinch it off had been paid in American, French, and German blood without quite collapsing it. By New Year's Day 1945, Hitler was desperate. He told Army Group G to break through in Alsace, link up with other forces, and change the map one last time. Nordwind failed. The bulge was shrinking. But nobody had told the men in the Colmar Pocket that the big play was over. They were still fighting like the next 48 hours might change everything. 3rd Battalion, 7th Infantry, had been on the line near the northern edge of the pocket for 18 straight days. It was the kind of winter the history books like to mention and rye eaters tend to skip past. Average temperature 10 degrees below zero. Snow cover complete. Moonlight almost none. Men slept in foxholes half full of frozen slush, wrapped in whatever blankets, greatcoats, and curses they had left. At night, German patrols slid through the forests like ghosts, poking at the lines, keeping nerves raw. In 2 weeks, the battalion had lost 43 men. Not in crisp, cinematic bayonet charges. In dribs and drabs, artillery, mortars, snipers, mines. Connor had been out of the line briefly just before this. A recent wound, one of many, had finally been bad enough to send him back to the hospital. He lasted 3 weeks there before discharging himself against strong medical advice. "My place is with the battalion," he told the doctors. He walked back in 2 days before the Germans made their next big effort. January 24th, 1945.0700. In the frozen command post dug into a French field near Thusen, or one of a dozen small villages whose names all start to sound the same when they're covered in snow and shell craters, Connor stood next to his battalion commander, Captain Paul G. B. Baker. Names vary by source, but someone of that rank held the clipboard. The map on the table was stiff with cold. Pencil lines marked American positions. Blue arrows showed friendly units. Red ones showed known German strongpoints. A runner burst in, stamping snow off his boots. "Sir, they're massing in the woods. Tanks too." The German 19th Army had pulled together roughly 600 infantry and more 6 Tiger tanks for this counterattack. Their intent was simple: hit 3rd Battalion's sector hard, punch through, and widen the Colmar Pocket northward. If they broke through here, they could roll up the flank, smash supporting units, and force a bigger Allied retreat. The 7th Infantry Regiment's job was to make sure that didn't happen. The problem was, on that particular morning, the 7th didn't have the toys you'd like to have when 6 Tigers are rolling your way. No American tanks in immediate support. No tank destroyers dug in where they needed to be. Just riflemen in the snow with a handful of bazookas that might scratch a Tiger's paint if you got close enough to read the serial number. On the map in the battalion CP, the road through the woods where the Germans were forming up was a simple black line. On the ground 400 yards away, it was a wall of trees and snow and men about to come out shooting. There was one asset that could make a difference: artillery, specifically a battery or more of 105mm howitzers parked a few miles to the rear. Fire missions could break up infantry, slow tanks, maybe throw a track or damage optics. But artillery, as everyone in that bunker knew, only worked if somebody could see the target and walk the rounds onto it. The battalion's forward observation post had taken a pounding in the initial German barrage. The observers were dead or out of contact. From the command post, they couldn't see through the trees. The guns in the rear were ready. They were effectively blind. Connor looked at the map. Then he looked at the little penciled mark that showed the destroyed forward OP. Then he looked at the empty space between that and the woods. 400 yards of open ground. Snow over frozen earth. No cover. No trenches. No shell holes deep enough to hide a man. On the far side of that space, through the trees, came the sound that made veterans' guts knot up more than any speech from Berlin. Tank engines. Deep. Guttural. Overlapping. The battalion commander understood the math. "If the Tigers get into our lines," he said, not needing to finish the sentence. They all knew what it meant. Tigers in your rear area meant Foxholes overrun. Riflemen by the Hund, red streaming back in panic. Units up and down the division front forced to fall back or be flanked. The only thing that could kill or halt 6 Tigers in that patch of France on that morning was well-placed artillery. The only way to get well-placed artillery was to have someone out there tell the guns where to hit. Connor picked up the EE-8 field telephone laying on the crate that passed for a desk. He grabbed the coil of wire next to it. 400 yards of line. He slung his rifle on his shoulder, not that he expected to use it. He looked at the battalion commander. "Where are you going?" the CO asked, though he already knew. "Forward," Connor said simply. "Somebody's got to see them. You just got out of the hospital. You're the intel officer, not FO. "Sir." Connor's Kentucky drawl was quiet. "I know this ground. I know our guns. I can do it." The commander could have ordered him to stay, could have told him to send someone else. He didn't. Maybe he shouldn't have. He just nodded once. Good luck, Lieutenant. Connor went out into the snow. He ran. He was 5'6", maybe 120 pounds soaking wet. Not a movie hero's silhouette. He also had the kind of wiry endurance you get from a youth of hauling tobacco bales, not barbells. The telephone wire paid out behind him as he sprinted across the open. The drum tucked under his left arm, handset clutched white-knuckled in his right. At about 100 yards, the German guns woke up again. They'd fired an initial preparation barrage before, ripping trees and ground around the American positions. Now, spotting one lone figure running toward their assembly area, they saw a priority target. Mortar rounds and artillery shells started to walk toward him. One exploded 40 yards to his left, showering him with cold earth and splinters of wood. Another dropped 30 yards to his right. They were bracketing him. He didn't slow down. A direct hit would vaporize him, phone, wire, and plan. Near miss could break bones, shred flesh. He'd been hurt before. He knew the difference. At 250 yards, a shell detonated just ahead of him, taking out a tree in his path. The trunk split down the middle and crashed across the snow. He vaulted it. Shrapnel hissed in the white like angry insects. Another round landed 15 yards to his left, a geyser of snow and dirt and fire. The blast wave hit him like a fist to the chest, stumbling his stride. He kept moving. He passed his own front line at around 300 yards, foxholes stamped into the snow, men in them staring as their intelligence officer, of all people, ran past them and Coy kept going. Connor, where the hell? He didn't break stride to answer. 30 yards beyond the last American foxhole, he finally saw something he could use. A farmer's drainage ditch, maybe 18 inches deep, not enough to stop bullets, not much protection against artillery, but low enough he could get his body below the snow level and his eyes just high enough to see the woods. He dove into it, hard enough to knock the wind out of himself. He flipped onto his belly, heart pounding, and yanked the handset to his ear. The wire had held. Somewhere behind him, the insulated copper snake ran back across the glowing coordinates of German gunners' maps and into the fire direction center. He cranked the magneto. Fire direction. This is 3rd Battalion OP. Over. Static. Then. Go ahead. OP. He gave his position. The FDC confirmed. 12 guns of 105mm howitzers. 3 batteries. Ready to fire. Right now, every eye and every gun on the battalion front was effectively linked to one man lying in a ditch with snow in his collar and 600 Germans coming for his face. He risked his first look over the rim. The German infantry were about 200 yards away and closing. They were moving through the trees with the kind of professionalism you only get by surviving long enough to become a veteran. Squad rushes. One squad would push forward to the next bit of cover, while the one behind laid down suppressive fire. Rifles at the hip, MP40s up, occasional grenades tossed ahead to clear what they thought must be foxholes. To Connor, the scene was painfully clear. He could see squad leaders signaling with hands and arms, men checking each other's spacing without even thinking about it, the way they were naturally angling toward the weaker seam in 3rd Battalion's line. Behind them, the Tigers. Even through the trees, you felt them as much as saw them. 60 tons of armor and engineering muscle, forcing smaller pines and saplings aside. Track links clanking, the occasional grind and squeal as a driver pivoted to line up with his mates. They were keeping their hulls in the trees for as long as possible, using the forest as cover from any imagined anti-tank guns. They'd break into the open only when it was time to finish the job. Connor could count at least 4 clearly. Turrets turning lazily. Commanders up in their hatches in padded helmets and field goggles. He knew there were 6. He dropped back into the ditch. Fire mission, he shouted into the handset. German infantry in the open. Grid. He rattled off coordinates. Range 600, 1-round battery. Over. Shot. Came back from FDC. Time of flight 40 seconds. 40 seconds is a long time when 600 men are walking toward you. He counted. 38. 39. 40. The sky screamed. The first 12 shells burst in the treetops. 150 yards. Behind the German infantry. Too long. Great for hitting reserves. Useless for the front line. The Germans barely flinched. They'd seen that pattern too many times. Artillery landing behind a moving formation meant the defenders were guessing, firing blind, hoping to catch the column somewhere. It meant they had a window before the Americans adjusted. Connor wasn't guessing. Drop 100, he yelled. Fire for effect. They repeated the grid. All batteries, fire for effect. He could hear the clatter of fire orders in the background. He popped his head up again. They were still coming. The second salvo landed in the middle of the German infantry. 12 105mm high-explosive shells, each carrying about 14 pounds of TNT, 168 pounds of explosive, plus casing fragments and shock waves, detonating in a 200-yard square where 600 men were packed in attack formation. Trees shattered. Where there had been trunks, there were now splinters. Where there had been snow on branches, there was a blizzard of white and gray and brown. Where there had been men, there were sudden absences. Connor saw a squad vanish as if someone had swiped an eraser across the scene. One instant they were hunched by a log. The next, the log and the men and the snow around them were thrown sideways in a blossom of force. Those who weren't hit directly went down anyway. Shrapnel doesn't care whether you're brave, scared, or indifferent. It just slices. Men dove behind whatever cover remained. Other men didn't move at all. The neat squad patterns dissolved. The advance stopped. Repeat. Connor snapped into the phone. Same coordinates. Keep it coming. FDC obliged. At maximal sustained rate, 12 guns could spit out another 48 shells a minute. That's almost 800 pounds of explosive every 60 seconds, pounding the same chunk of forest. 3rd Battalion's artillery assets had just turned that stretch of woods into the worst place in Alsace to be a German infantry. Man, but the Tigers were still coming. Armor doesn't scare easily. The first salvos had gone high, bursting in or above the trees. Most of that blast washed harmlessly over the thick steel roofs of the tanks. They kept rolling. As the infantry scattered and dove for holes in the ground, the Tigers ground out of the tree line into the open. 6 dark shapes, 2 in front, 2 slightly behind, 2 more in the rear rank. A wedge designed to punch through. Their turrets were alive now. Commanders stood in their hatches, binoculars or periscopes up, looking for muzzle flashes in the American line. One of them saw an American foxhole 300 yards to Connor's right. The 88mm main gun cracked. Even from his ditch, Connor felt the shock. Where the foxhole had been, a column of earth, snow, and whatever had been inside that hole geysered upward and fell back in a rough circle that did not include living men. Another Tiger banged. Another hole on the American side of the field ceased to be a place any human could continue to occupy. They were 300 yards away. At the Tiger's slow but steady pace, they'd be in the battalion's shallow line in 4 or 5 minutes. Once a Tiger got into your rear, everything in your training manuals turned into confetti. Connor shifted his focus. "Enemy armor advancing!" he yelled into the handset, swearing as the blast from a nearby 105 impact momentarily turned his hearing into a high-pitched whine. "Adjust fire onto tanks. Stand by for corrections." Artillery isn't built to kill tanks. It's built to kill what comes with ishimibamo tanks. Infantry in the open. Support weapons. Trucks. Command posts. Bridges. Tanks are relatively small, relatively fast, and very heavily armored. 5mm round can wreck a tank if it hits just right. Top armor, tracks, engine deck. But just right is hard to do on purpose from miles away, even with a good observer. The first adjusted salvos ended around the Tigers. One hit 10 yards in front of the lead tank. The driver drove right through the settling dust. Another burst behind the formation. The crews barely noticed. "Drop 50, Connor said. "Right over the lead. Fire for effect." The next rounds came in lower and closer. One shell nailed the right track of the lead Tiger. Even from his distance, Connor saw the track whip apart, looping up like a metal snake as the drive sprocket spun free. The Tiger slewed hard to the right and stopped, its engine revving. Immobilized doesn't mean dead. The turret was still working. The 88mm still loaded. As a stationary armored pillbox, it was now extremely dangerous. Another shell hit on the rear deck of a middle-rank Tiger. Smoke boiled out of engine vents. The crew inside made an instant decision: bail or burn or fight the fire. Hatches popped. Wet snow was kicked onto glowing metal. Whether they stayed or left, that tank was not advancing anymore. 4 Tigers remained mobile, guns still cracking. Connor watched a third shell bounce off a glacis plate, white flash and shower of sparks, no real damage. "Repeat," he said, voice hoarse now. "Keep hitting them. Don't let them through." He could feel each blast as a physical hit in his chest, concussion smacking the air in his little ditch around. Shrapnel was singing overhead in a continuous whirring shower. He knew. That at least some of those fragments were landing within a few dozen yards of his boots. The artillerymen back at the battery duty stations knew it too. They kept firing. Each minute that passed, fewer German infantry were trying to keep up with those tanks. Each minute that passed, more of the tanks were stopping, not because some wonder weapon had sliced through their armor, but because enough blast had chewed their tracks, engines, and nerves down. By the time the smoke cleared enough for anyone else in 3rd Battalion to see what was happening, the picture above their foxholes had changed dramatically. Where there had been a wall of gray-green and steel and hate, there was now a chaotic, burning, half-smashed mess. German bodies, craters, trees reduced to shattered stumps, and a line of Tigers either immobilized, burning, or turning away. The attack had been broken. The 19th German Army's last desperate push at that sector had smashed itself to pieces on a point of land marked, on no map, with the shape of one man in a ditch. When it was over, when the last shell's echo faded and the tanks that could still reverse did, Connor finally let go of the handset properly. His hands were trembling. His ears rang like someone had replaced his brain with a kettle. He crawled backwards out of the ditch, rolling onto his back for a second to gasp at air that wasn't full of dust and TNT fumes. Behind him, in the foxholes, men cheered. They didn't know all the details yet. They knew one thing: the Tigers weren't coming. The infantry that had been marching behind them were either dead, wounded, or in full retreat. 3rd Battalion was still on the line. In the days that followed, reconnaissance patrols, and later, full occupation of the ground they'd defended, confirmed the numbers roughly. Bodies, shattered trees, burned-out tank hulks. The German assault that should have punched a hole in 7th Army's flank had devolved into a dead end. When the paperwork made its way up the line, the language was measured. First Lieutenant Garland M. Connor voluntarily left the safety of the command post to direct artillery fire from an exposed position in front of the battalion's defensive line, remained in his position for 3 hours under constant enemy small arms, tank, and artillery fire, adjusted fire thean, had destroyed an estimated 50 enemy soldiers and halted an attack by 6 enemy tanks and 600 infantry. It was good enough for a Distinguished Service Cross, For a while. After the war, Connor went back to Kentucky, back to the farm, back to fields and seasons and a life that didn't have tracers in it anymore. Like a lot of men of his generation, he didn't talk much about how he earned his row of ribbon bars. His wife, Pauline, knew pieces. Comrades knew more. Officially, he was one more highly decorated veteran in a state full of them. He lived with pain. Old wounds never fully healed. He carried shrapnel in his body until he died in 1998. His DSC, his silver stars, his bronze stars, his purple hearts. 7. Sat on a wall and gathered dust. Then, years after his death, people who'd served with him decided that Dusty wasn't good enough. They pushed. They dug up old after-action reports, witness statements, maps with his corrections, newspaper archives. They argued that what he had done on January 24, 1945, wasn't just extraordinary heroism fit for a DSC. It fit the higher standard, above and beyond the call of duty. It took until Salvo, 2014. 70 years after that morning in the snow, Garland M. Connor was posthumously awarded the WWII Medal of Honor. The citation read like they all do. Formal, precise, stripped of metaphor. What it can't transmit is that moment in the ditch when a 25-year-old tobacco farmer turned intel officer, wounded 7 times, looked at 6 tigers and 600 men, and decided the only sane thing to do was something that looked insane on paper. Call it on my position. If I die, I die. If I don't do it, we all die. Men like that exist in every war. Most of them never get a medal. Most of their stories never make it past kitchen tables and VFW halls. That's why you're telling this one. Because somewhere out there, there's a grandson or granddaughter of someone who fought at Colmar and never knew the name of the officer whose voice was on the phone that day. Now they do. And the next time any of us see a hill marked Siegfried Line in a history book or a cold French field in a black and white photo, we'll know that for at least a few minutes in 1945, one of those fields was defended by a man who didn't just stay behind the maps. He ran past the line, laid down in front of the attack, and told the guns to come to him.